Hi guys, my name is Stacey Pyne and this is my book Goldie. I'm going to read a story for you today. This story is called Asher. The room was finished. Asher could hardly believe it. Standing in the doorway, he scanned the space from one corner to the other. It was perfect. He'd worked on the wooden floors for a solid month, sanding, polishing, perfecting, and now they shone from their final varnishing. The large oak table running down the centre of the room was a masterpiece, something that any craftsman would be proud to have created, and he'd created it. He stepped forward and ran his fingers along the grain of wood, breathing in the scent of fresh polish. He'd stayed up to an unearthly hour the night before, the familiar tugging in his spirit calling him to clean the room. He'd dusted every corner from ceiling to floorboards. He'd gone over every crevice in the wooden chairs, wiping away sawdust and fingerprints. He couldn't stop, wouldn't have been able to sleep until it was complete. Asher had inherited the family home last year after his father passed away. It had been a time of grief, loss, and adjustment. He had wandered aimlessly around his home for months, mourning for his father. He'd climbed up the stairs one morning, as he so often did, making his way to the rooftop. But he'd stopped at the doorway to the guest room. He hadn't paid it much attention in the past. Stepping into the room, it was obvious that it hadn't been used in years. After Asher's mother had died, his father had struggled to keep up with the house alone. Asher had stood in the doorway thinking fondly of his parents and how they had been so different to this dark, lifeless room, when he'd seen what could only be described as a vision. The air was stale and dust filled the room, but he had imagined it revived, brought to life, and full of purpose. Where there was a sleeping mat and a dusty old storage cabinet, Asher saw pristine, polished wooden floorboards and a large dining table set for entertaining. He had looked at the small window hidden beneath a faded curtain, laced with spiderwebs, with barely a trace of light piercing through. And in its place he had seen a large, light-filled window, with sunshine flooding into the space. He had been deeply stirred, hardly able to sleep through the night in anticipation of getting started. Something within him urged him on, giving him a sense that he must begin the work. He decided not to think about it too much. He didn't know what he was preparing the room for, or even if it would ever be admired or enjoyed, but there was no mistaking the whispering in his spirit as he worked. A few weeks into the project, Asher had shared his plans with Zach. That had been a mistake. His childhood friend, the one constant in his life, had laughed and called Asher an idiot for spending his hard-earned coin on a guest room. Asher, in all the years that I've known you, you've never entertained visitors in your home or had someone stay the night. Zach punched him in the shoulder. You should have come and built me an expensive guest room with a dining table. You know that I'd have put it to good use. Asher knew that Zach had been joking, but he also knew that Zach was right. Asher was an introvert who preferred to keep to himself, while Zach was the life of the party. He and Zach had always been polar opposites. But that familiar tug had been there the following morning, stronger than the day before, urging him to continue with his work in the guest room. He couldn't have stopped, even if he'd wanted to. His hands and his feet seemed to know a secret that he hadn't been let in on. Now Asher headed for the front door, his empty water pitcher in hand, when he was struck with a thought. The box of treasures. He placed his pitcher beside the door and headed for the storeroom in his courtyard, excitement rising within him. He couldn't believe he'd forgotten the treasures. Ash's mother had inherited them from an aunt who was quite the entertainer. If he remembered correctly, the box was full of copper and bronze tableware. He reached back behind a tall stack of fabric and found the box that he'd never expected to have a use for. He'd only kept it in case he got into a fix and needed some fast coin. But now he was excited with the idea of setting his beautiful new table. He placed the box on the floor, opened the lid, and smiled. This would be perfect. Asher carried the forgotten treasure to the guest room. He was pleased to discover a large embroidered tablecloth beneath the dishes. It was folded carefully, no doubt to protect the precious contents. He shook the linen cloth out and spread it across the table. It fit like a glove. There was a peaceful presence in his room today, with a gentle breeze blowing the new curtains and sunlight pouring into the room. An hour later, Asher stood back, admiring his handiwork. The copper and bronze was something else, setting the room off to perfection. It was a shame that no one else would enjoy it. The thought was discouraging. He took one last look at the space he'd created and closed the door. The room was complete now. He walked slowly down the stairs and headed to the town well with his water pitcher. Asher filled his pitcher at the well in the center of town. He couldn't help feeling down. He knew his room was finished, but restoring the room had been his life for many months. Had he wasted his time? Was his deep belief that his efforts were somehow part of a bigger plan a foolish mistake, like Zach had said? Asher walked home slowly, scuffing his sandals along the dirt as he went. He thought about dropping into Zach's, but decided against it. He would see him later for the Passover meal anyway. As he turned into his street, he heard a noise behind him. He looked over his shoulder. Two men were behind him. They were dressed simply and chatting. Asher hadn't seen them in his neighborhood before. They must be visiting one of his neighbors for Passover. The water pitcher was growing heavy by the time he arrived home. He stepped inside and placed it with relief on the table. There was a knock at the door. It was the two men from the road. "Can I help you?" Asher asked. "Yes, please," one of the men replied with a smile. "Can we speak to the owner of the house?" "You're speaking to him. Why did they want to know?" "Great." The man's tone was positive, but he looked nervous. The stranger glanced back to his friend, who stood further back on the doorstep. Should Asher be worried? Were the men dangerous? They seemed harmless enough, but what did they want? Asher had no idea. The teacher asks, "Where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples?" The man looked Asher square in the eyes. His words held an authority that wasn't there before, as though he'd remembered something, as though his words were not his own. Asher stared at the men, his mind blank. He couldn't speak, and he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Surely they didn't mean his guest room. How could these men have known about his project? Was this some sort of trick? Was Zach playing with him? As he looked at each of them, it was clear that they were serious. The teacher. The familiar tug in his spirit pushed him forward. Tears pricked his eyes as he ushered them inside. They looked as surprised as he was as they removed the sandals from their feet. Asher took the lead, full of amazement and wonder. The two strangers followed him up the stairs to his guest room. Luke 22, 9-13. "Where do you want us to prepare it?" they asked him. He replied, As soon as you enter Jerusalem, a man carrying a pitcher of water will meet you. Follow him. At the house he enters, say to the owner, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples?' He will take you upstairs to a large room that is already set up. That is where you should prepare our meal." Thanks, guys.